Okay, so this is the section on race and ethnicity. This is covering chapter 8 in the real world, and then also that D'Angelo reading. It's one of the chapters in her book, so just make sure that you look into that one. I'm not going to be going over it in this lecture. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So this meme really shows the understanding of race here. So this woman at the SAG Awards looked at Rashida Jones and said, you look like you've just come off of an island or something. You're very tan, very tropical. And she said to the person, I mean, you know, I'm ethnic. And I think her face here says it all. And really what this is setting up for you is race in particular, is this arbitrary socially constructed thing that people put on other individuals. And we could go into an entire discussion as to why this white woman thinks that Rashida Jones is also a white woman, just tan and off the beach. But we're not going to go into that today. But it just kind of sets up this idea that we don't really know somebody else's race. We make assumptions, and they're very arbitrary and socially constructed and created based off of really ridiculous things historically. And we're going to go into that in this lecture. And depending on how long some of this takes me, you might have to watch 2 videos on race just because it's super important for the class. So let's go ahead and get some of the definitions out of the way. Defining race and ethnicity. So race it's socially constructed category based on real or perceived biological differences between groups of people. And so again, what I want you to really take into consideration here are these socially defined categories based on real or perceived biological differences. So it's not actually race is biological. It's just we perceive differences that we've socially defined that have something to do with these biological features we associate with people. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is a socially defined category based on common language, religion, nationality, history, or other cultural factors. And so usually in class, I will ask you things like, can somebody give me an example of race? And a lot of times people say things like black, white. And then when I ask about an ethnicity, Hispanic or Latinx comes up, or religions, right? So being Jewish. Another thing to keep in mind is a term called nationality. And for a really long time, what I find very interesting is in other parts of the world outside of the United States, we always sort of suggested that they had nationalism problems, not racism problems. But after everything that happened with Harry and Meghan Markle, it's racism. It's racism. And it's very funny to me that the British got to kind of hide under this, well, you know, we have national differences and certain nationalities that come in, we kind of have issues with them, and that's okay because, you know, they're outsiders. But we're not racist like the United States, and then, you know, they totally and 100% are. So just something to keep in mind. That for a while that term nationalism was used, and really the argument is that it's just still racism, right? Okay, so race is a social construction. It isn't based on biology. It changes. The racial categories we have had here in the United States have changed over time, and not a single one of them has had a firm boundary. And so I'm really mad at myself because I filled out the census yesterday and I didn't take a single screen cap of any of the census questions, but essentially it just asks who all lives in the house, do you rent or own? How many people are, you know, paying for the house? What are the ages? And then they ask the race and ethnicity of everybody in the house, and then that's done. Those are the census questions. That's all they ask. That's all they want to know. So to look at this, we are going to look at sort of our timeline of the census over the years. If it decides to load. You know, we're all using the internet now because we're all stuck at home, and therefore it doesn't work as well. So what the census calls us is different. And so starting in 1790, we really only had a couple of options. We had free white males, free white females, all other free persons, and slaves. right? And so 1960 onward, something to keep in mind, people could choose their own race. 2000 onward, you could choose more than one racial category. But as you look along this piece here, like 1860 was the first time we had Indian. And this was Native Americans, right? And then it wasn't until 1930 that we actually got Hispanic, but then we dropped it for a while, right? And then we picked it back up in 1970. So these racial categories that we've created are completely arbitrary. And let's not forget, where is it? This wonderful time period where we had all of these ridiculous names for humans, right? So you can, when you have access to the slides, you can kind of click through and play with this. And even over here, it gives you an example of what a census sort of looked like at that time. So you can play with that on your own. I'm still mad at myself for not taking screen caps of the census, especially because it's all online now. Okay. So we do have some ethnic options, and I have those in quotes because you'll understand pretty quickly what we mean by ethnic options. So there's two terms that your book gives you, symbolic ethnicity and situational ethnicity, right? So symbolic ethnicity is only relevant on specific occasions, and it doesn't significantly impact your day-to-day life. So one of the best examples of symbolic ethnicity, and one that I use all the time in my class, because if you can't tell, I'm very pale and I've got freckles everywhere. My last name's McIntyre. There's some Scottish and some Irish in my history. I could celebrate St. Patrick's Day every year, and actually celebrate it and be like, look at my, Irish heritage. But I don't actually know anything about that, and I have no connection to it whatsoever, so I don't. But if for some reason I did, I could be practicing symbolic ethnicity, where I'm only going to use it when it's fun for me. Very similar to how out of nowhere on the 5th of May, everyone seems to know incorrect things about what Cinco de Mayo is. That's symbolic ethnicity, right? There's a bunch of other examples of it, but St. Patrick's Day is really one of the easiest ones to sort of understand there. Now, situational ethnicity, this is when you as an individual sort of give a cost-benefit analysis as to whether or not you want to share your ethnic identity with somebody else. And your textbook gives us a really great example about this doctor who's Lebanese. And when she was working in a major city, it wasn't really useful for her to tell people that she was Lebanese. And then she moved to a rural area that just so happened to have a really high Lebanese immigrant population in the area. And so then it became actually beneficial for her to share with other people that she too was in fact Lebanese. It created a better relationship with her patients, and it actually kind of gave her more patients, because this large population wanted somebody that was like them, that they could trust. So situational ethnicity is you in the moment making a cost-benefit analysis and deciding, is it useful for me or is it harmful for me to sort of share my ethnicity with another person, right? So those two different options, symbolic ethnicity and situational ethnicity, this is how we can sort of share our ethnicity to other people if we want to, or if it's beneficial to us, or if we can get really shit-faced with everybody else in the state. Which we didn't get to this year because all of the parades were closed. Yeah. Okay. All right, moving on. Now, a minority group. This is what's going to get really interesting for us, right? So a minority group is this systematically denied access to power and resources, specifically in comparison to the dominant group in society. A minority group does not necessarily mean fewer in numbers, right? Per the gender chapter, you could probably determine that women are considered a minority group in terms of being denied access to power and resources. However, we are not minority in numbers, okay? When it comes to minority group and race, Birmingham, again, is a wonderful example of this, right? So the minority group in Birmingham is being Black, but Black people make up 70% of the population in the city. And so they are not actually the minority when it comes to numbers, but they are absolutely the minority when it comes to power and resources. And you can see this everywhere. It's not just a problem in the South, right? When it comes to racism, it gets very interesting when you start looking across the United States, because, we have these stereotypes that the South is the only place that's racist, but That is not, in fact, the case, because some of the most segregated areas are in the north, particularly in New York, and Chicago. So they've got a little bit of a different setup going on up there. But yeah, the South is the only one blamed for it. And this is also where I go into how a lot of times when we end up with academics all over the world, and all over the United States in particular, who are race scholars, I'm looking at you guys, race scholars out there, who write and research in places like Colorado and Washington State and parts of California. And then you come to Birmingham to give a presentation or do a job talk, and you are terrified of wandering around the city because it's the first time you've actually been around the people that you research. So, racism finds its way into many different aspects of our life, even academics who study it. So, yeah, this is just going to be a fun lecture. This is the racial and ethnic population in the United States from 2016. This comes directly out of your book. 61% of our population is white non-Hispanic. So I don't really understand why people get all up in arms when they see too many black people or too many brown people or too many Hispanics or Asians. We're still, the whites are still totally winning here. Some of you might have expected this mapped or this pie chart to be a little bit different than it actually is. But this is based off of the census, or not the census. This is based off of other research. But these are the census categories, right? Now, these are the projections, right? And these projections are the things that make people a little nervous. And you know what? They should be. The nervousness is challenging those ideas that the minority group of access to power should, by some weird divine right, have that access. And they shouldn't. We're all humans. We should be way, way, way more equal than we actually are when it comes to race, particularly here in the United States, because we fucked up for about 400 years. And then some. Yeah, we'll talk about that more. But yeah, particularly the issue here is the blue is the 2060 data. And so the fact that we drop down that much and this group of individuals drops, or increases that much is really where the fear is, and is probably also why we have all of the ridiculous laws happening down at the border. Yeah, no, racism is the reason for that. Racism is the reason for that. And yeah, it's these projections make the people in power nervous because they're worried that they will no longer be in power anymore. And, quite frankly, you should be worried because, you just should be worried. All right, so some theory we need to get into today. We've got structural functionalism and conflict theory. These are things you've seen over and over and over again. This focus on the ways that race creates social ties and strengthens group bonds. It acknowledges that these ties can lead to violence and social conflict between groups, but, strengthening those bonds, and you look like me, so I like you, and I don't look like you, so I'm going to let you stay over there. You can see where the problems with structural functionalism come up, because it's basically just descriptive and only descriptive. Now, conflict theory, on the other hand, focuses on the struggle for power and control over these scarce resources. Very similar. So conflict theory, when it comes to race, here in the United States, the biggest one is white versus black. But you can keep going from there, right? Every other racial category can be compared this way. And then symbolic interactionism is always my favorite, but the ways that race, class, and gender intersect to produce an individual's identity, that goes back to that intersectionality we talked about before, but it sees race as an aspect of identity established through interactions. Race is socially constructed, and so if we are the ones socially constructing these views, we also have these insane implicit biases attached to those views. So the first time that you see someone based on the color of their skin, you make an assumption, right? Passing is living as if a different racial category. This is where we can have that wonderful conversation about Rachel Dolezal, but we're not going to do it because I don't get to talk to you all individually. And then double consciousness, we've talked about this before. It's that divided identity experienced by blacks in the United States. This comes from W.E.B. Du Bois. We've gone into this